In the stillness of grief, Silas McCade's hands remembered what his heart tried to forget, the warmth of Eleanor's touch, now replaced by the cold of empty rooms. 3 years of silence had weathered his soul, like Wyoming winters had weathered his barn. Then came the desperate knock, a woman and 2 small children, snowflakes clinging to their eyelashes, hope fading from their eyes. He opened his door, not knowing he was opening his heart. Through small gestures, a jar of honey, blue ribbons, patient lessons, life crept back into a house that had forgotten how to breathe. Sometimes the greatest journeys begin with the smallest steps taken in the deepest snow. If this story of second chances touches your heart, let us know with a like. Each one honors those who found the courage to begin again when all seemed lost. And please share in the comments how you think Silas and Willa's story unfolds. Does love truly have the power to melt the harshest winters of our hearts? The wind carried no mercy that December morning. It howled across the barren Wyoming plains like a wounded animal, driving needles of ice into any exposed flesh foolish enough to challenge its domain. Willa May Carrigan pulled the threadbare woolen scarf tighter around her face, leaving only her eyes exposed to the biting cold. Those eyes, deep brown with flecks of amber when caught in certain light, had once sparked with defiance and hope. Now they simply remained vigilant, scanning the endless white horizon for landmarks as her boots crunched through knee-deep snow. Behind her trudged her daughters, Rosie and Ruthie, 7-year-old twins connected by more than their identical freckled noses and wheat-colored hair. They shared a silent language of glances and gestures that had become increasingly necessary in the months living under their uncle's hostile roof. The girls huddled together under a single moth-eaten blanket, taking turns sheltering each other from the wind's sharpest blasts. Not much farther now, Willa whispered, more to herself than to the girls. The words crystallized in the air before her and vanished. She had repeated this promise for the past 3 miles, since they'd left the main road and cut across the open country toward what she prayed was the McCade Ranch. Her fingers had long since lost feeling inside her gloves, simple cotton things never meant for a Wyoming winter. The sensation reminded her of numbness of a different sort, the kind that had settled into her chest when Thomas, her brother, had stood at his doorway the previous night, firelight silhouetting his tall frame. 3 months I've fed you, and those girls, he had said, his voice flat as the frozen plains. 3 months of extra mouths eating food meant for a working man and his sons. You've worn out your welcome, Willa. She hadn't begged. The Carrigan blood in her veins was too proud for that. Instead, she had gathered their meager belongings while her daughters slept and whispered them awake before dawn. By first light, they were already ghosts on Thomas's property, their footprints filling with fresh snow behind them. A rumor had reached her about the McCade Ranch, that the owner was a widower who kept to himself, a man who might need help running his household. It wasn't much to stake the lives of her children on, but Willa had learned that in this harsh territory, sometimes a thread of possibility was all you had to follow. The wind shifted suddenly, slicing through a gap in her coat. Willa stumbled, her exhausted legs betraying her as she fell forward into the snow. The cold shocked her face, momentarily stealing her breath. For one terrible moment, she felt the urge to remain there, to let the snow gradually cover her like a gentle blanket, to surrender to the exhaustion that had been her constant companion. "Mama!" Ruthie's voice, small but urgent, broke through the dangerous thoughts. A tiny hand, still somehow warm, touched her cheek. Willa pushed herself up, snow clinging to her eyelashes and melting against her skin. She looked into her daughters. Worried eyes, Eleanor's eyes she always thought, though the girls had never known their father. "I'm all right, little bird," she said, forcing a smile that ached with the cold, "just catching my breath." On the horizon, barely visible through the swirling snow, the dark outline of a structure finally emerged, a house with a barn beside it. Smoke curled from a chimney, a sign of life and warmth that seemed almost mythical after hours in the desolate white landscape. Willa straightened her back and adjusted the small pack containing everything they owned. The weight of motherhood pressed down on her shoulders, heavier than any physical burden. She had promised her daughters safety and home when their father had abandoned them for the gold fields of California. She had failed at the first when Thomas cast them out, The second now lay ahead, a stranger's house that represented their last hope before the winter claimed them. "Look there," she pointed, injecting a confidence into her voice that she didn't feel. "That's where we're going. That's where we'll be warm again." The twins' faces brightened with childish hope, the kind Willa had almost forgotten how to feel. Their trust in her was a knife twisting in her heart. She took their small hands in hers, and together they pushed forward against the wind toward the unknown figure of Silas McCade and whatever fate awaited them. The McCade ranch house loomed before them like a ship emerging from fog, weathered wooden siding the color of wet ash, a sagging porch that whispered of neglect, windows that reflected the gray sky like unblinking eyes. It was not the salvation Willa had imagined during their desperate journey, but it was solid and real, and smoke still curled from the chimney like a beckoning finger. Willa paused at the bottom step, her heart hammering against her ribs. Pride had sustained her through the journey, but now, faced with the moment of asking for charity, she felt it threatening to crack like thin ice. The twins pressed against her sides, their small bodies trembling with cold and exhaustion. "Wait here," she whispered, guiding them to shelter against the side of the porch. She brushed snow from Rosie's eyelashes, tucked a strand of hair behind Ruthie's ear, small gestures of motherhood that had become ritual, a way of saying, "I am still here. I will protect you." The 3 wooden steps to the porch creaked beneath, her weight, each one a question. What if he turns you away? What then, Willa May? She had no answer. There was no other ranch for miles, no other hope before nightfall. Her knuckles hovered before the door, hesitant. Then, drawing herself up to her full height, which had once been called impressive but now felt diminished by hunger and worry, she knocked. 3 sharp raps that sounded hollow against the solid oak. Silence followed, stretching out until Willa wondered if the house was abandoned despite the smoke. She raised her hand to knock again when the door swung inward with a groan of disused hinges. The man who stood before her seemed carved from the same rough timber as his house, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind, into something resembling the rocky outcroppings of the Wyoming landscape. His beard was shot through with gray, his eyes the pale blue of winter sky, distant and cold. Those eyes regarded her without welcome, without curiosity, only a flat assessment that made Willa feel as insubstantial as the snow melting at her feet. "Mr. McCade?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The man said nothing, merely continued his unsettling appraisal. "My name is Willa May Carrigan," she continued, refusing to be cowed by his silence. "I've come about work. I heard in town that you might be in need of household help." His eyebrows drew together slightly, the only indication that her words had registered at all. "I'm a capable cook and housekeeper," Willa pressed on. "I can tend gardens come spring, preserve food, mend clothes. I worked for 3 years in a boarding house in Cheyenne before—" She stopped herself. Her past was not something she offered freely, especially not to this stone-faced stranger. "Not hiring," he said finally, his voice a rough gravel road, unused and weathered. He began to close the door. Desperation surged through Willa like a flood breaking through ice. "Please," she said, the word foreign and bitter on her tongue. "My daughters and I have nowhere else to go. My brother turned us out in the storm—" "Daughters?" Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the granite. Willa turned and gestured to the twins, who had crept to the bottom of the steps, their small faces peering up with identical expressions of apprehension and hope. Silas McCade's gaze moved from Willa to the girls, lingering on their faces. Something passed across his features then, a shadow of remembrance perhaps, or recognition, gone. So quickly Willa might have imagined it. "We won't be trouble," she added softly. "We can sleep in the barn if need be. I only ask for shelter until the worst of winter passes, and I'll work for our keep." Silas's hand remained on the door, poised to close it. The moment stretched between them like a thread pulled taut, ready to snap. Willa held her breath, aware that her daughter's survival hung on the decision of this stranger, whose eyes seemed to hold all the coldness of the Wyoming winter. Then, wordlessly, he stepped aside. Relief flooded through Willa so intensely that her knees nearly buckled. She gestured quickly to the twins, who hurried up the steps and past the threshold, into the relative warmth of the house. Willa followed, the weight of Silas McCade's gaze heavy on her back as she crossed from the howling wilderness into the unknown territory of his domain. The door closed behind them with the finality of a coffin lid, sealing them into a new life for Betty. Terror worse, the interior of the McCade house received them with shadows and stale air, as if the building itself had forgotten the purpose of windows and doors. Willa stood in the dim entryway, her daughters pressed against her skirts, while her eyes adjusted to the gloom. Dust motes swirled in the weak light filtering through curtained windows. The air smelled of wood smoke, unwashed dishes, and the particular emptiness of a place long unlived in despite being occupied. Silas moved past them without a word, his large frame seeming to fill the narrow hallway. His boots left tracks in the fine layer of dust coating the wooden floor. Willa followed, guiding the twins with gentle pressure on their shoulders. They passed a sitting room where furniture huddled beneath sheets like ghosts, a dining room where the table was bare except for a single plate and cup, before arriving at a kitchen that spoke of neglect and solitary meals. "You can stay here," Silas said, gesturing vaguely around the kitchen. "There's a room off the back, used to be for storage." His words fell like stones into the quiet. Willa nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The room he indicated was little more than a pantry with a small window, but it was shelter, and the proximity to the kitchen stove meant it would be one of the warmer spaces in the house. "Thank you," she managed finally. "We won't be a burden." Silas regarded her with those distant blue eyes, his expression unreadable. "I eat at sundown," he said. "Work in the barn till then." Without waiting for a response, he turned and left, the back door closing firmly behind him. Left alone in the strange kitchen, Willa exhaled slowly, releasing tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The twins looked up at her with identical expressions of uncertainty. "It's all right," she whispered, kneeling to embrace them. "We're safe now. We have a roof and walls to keep out the wind." She didn't mention the coldness of their reception, the precariousness of their position. Children, she had learned, did not need to carry the weight of adult concerns. "Is this our home now, Mama?" Rosie asked, her small voice echoing in the empty kitchen. The question pierced Willa's heart. "For now," she answered carefully. "Mr. McCade has been kind enough to give us shelter." "He doesn't smile," Ruthie observed with a child's blunt honesty. "Some people forget how," Willa said, brushing snow from her daughter's coat. "Now let's see about making this space a bit more welcoming, shall we?" The afternoon passed in quiet industry. Willa explored the kitchen, taking inventory of its meager supplies. She found flour weevilled and stale, potatoes sprouting in a forgotten bin, a few onions shriveled to husks. The pantry, their new bedroom, contained crates that she emptied and repurposed as crude beds, padding them with their own blankets and the girls' few clothes. As shadows lengthened across the kitchen floor, Willa set water to boil on the wood, stove and began to knead dough for simple biscuits, using the last of their own supplies. The familiar rhythmic movement of her hands grounded her, a ritual unchanged despite the unfamiliar surroundings. The twins sat at the kitchen table, unusually subdued. They had always been quiet children. Necessity had taught them the virtue of silence in their uncle's house, but now they seemed almost ghost-like, afraid to disturb the stillness of the McCade house. When the back door opened again, all three started like deer at a hunter's approach. Silas filled the doorframe, bringing with him the smell of cold air and animals. He paused, observing the transformed kitchen, the swept floor, the bubbling pot on the stove, the fresh biscuits cooling on the table. Something crossed his face then, an emotion Willa couldn't name. "You didn't need to cook," he said, his voice still that same gravelled road. "It's the arrangement," Willa replied simply. "We stay, I work." Silas regarded her for a long moment, then nodded once. Acknowledgement, not gratitude. He moved to the basin in the corner, washed his hands with methodical precision, then sat at the table. The twins watched him with wide eyes like sparrows observing a hawk. Willa served the simple meal, vegetable stew and biscuits, in silence. They ate without conversation, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls, and the howl of the wind outside. Silas ate mechanically, without apparent pleasure or displeasure, as if food were merely fuel for the body's engine. When he finished, he rose and placed his bowl in the basin. Then, unexpectedly, he reached into a high cupboard and brought down a jar of honey, dark amber and crystallized with age. "For the biscuits," he said, placing it before the twins. It was the first gesture of anything approaching kindness, and it hung in the air between them, significant as a treaty offering. That night, after Silas had retreated to whatever part of the house he occupied, Willa lay awake in the dark pantry, listening to her daughter's even breathing. The hard floor beneath the makeshift beds pressed against her back, a constant reminder of their tenuous position. Through the small window, moonlight spilled across the floor in a silver puddle, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the still air. In the silence of the sleeping house, Willa allowed herself to acknowledge the fear that had been her constant companion since Thomas had cast them out. Fear not just of the physical dangers, cold, hunger, exposure, but of this new dependency. They were at the mercy of a stranger, a man whose grief hung about him like a visible shroud. The honey jar stood as both promise and question. Was there humanity left in Silas McCade, or had sorrow hollowed him out completely? Willa turned onto her side, curling around Ruthie's small form, drawing what comfort she could from her daughter's warmth. Tomorrow, she decided, she would begin to earn their place here more definitively. She would become indispensable. It was the only security available to a woman alone in this harsh territory, to make herself necessary. Outside, the wind continued its mournful song, carrying snow that collected in the corners of window panes, like tears frozen before they could. Fall morning light filtered through the small pantry window, casting weak shadows across the floor where Willa and her daughters slept. Willa woke first, as was her habit, a mother's vigilance that had become instinct. For a disorienting moment, she didn't recognize her surroundings. Then memory rushed back. The journey through snow, the cold reception, the silent meal. They were in the McCade house, tenants of a man's reluctant charity. She extricated herself carefully from between the twins, who had migrated toward her warmth during the night. They slept on, faces peaceful in repose, untroubled by the adult. Concerns that had already etched themselves into Willa's thoughts. She watched them breathe for a moment, drawing strength from their existence. Then she rose, straightened her crumpled dress as best she could, and ventured into the kitchen. The house was silent, though pale light beneath a door down the hall suggested Silas was already awake. Willa moved quietly, stoking the kitchen stove, and setting water to boil. She found coffee grounds in a tin, measured them carefully, economy born of necessity, and set them to steep. As she worked, her eyes catalogued the kitchen more thoroughly than had been possible in yesterday's exhaustion. The space spoke of abandonment, not just untidiness. Curtains hung limply, edges frayed and color bleached by sun. Dishes were functional but chipped, stored haphazardly. A shelf held a few books with dust-covered spines, untouched for what seemed like years. Everything necessary existed, but nothing that spoke of comfort or care. The only incongruous element was a china teacup displayed on a high shelf, delicate and impossibly fine amidst the utilitarian surroundings. Its blue pattern caught the early light, drawing Willa's eye like a jewel in dirt. She reached toward it, curious. "Don't touch that." Silas stood in the doorway, his voice sharp as a knife's edge. Willa's hand froze mid-air, then withdrew slowly. "I'm sorry," she said. "I was only looking." Silas regarded her with those pale eyes, expression closed as a locked door. "It was Eleanor's," he said finally, the name emerging like something painful extracted. Eleanor. The name hung in the air between them. His wife, Willa surmised, the ghost whose absence filled the house more completely than any presence. "The coffee's ready," Willa offered, changing the subject. "Would you like some?" Silas gave a curt nod and seated himself at the table. Willa poured the steaming liquid into a mug and placed it before him, then hesitated, uncertain of her place. "In this strange household hierarchy, my daughters and I can make ourselves useful today," she said, filling the awkward silence. "The house could use attention." Silas took a long drink of coffee before responding. "Do what you want with the kitchen and that back room. The rest of the house is fine as it is." Fine was not the word Willa would have chosen for the neglected spaces she'd glimpsed, but she recognized the statement for what it was, a boundary. Of course, she agreed. We'll respect your privacy. Something like surprise flickered across his features, there and gone so quickly, Willa might have imagined it. He finished his coffee in silence, then rose. I'll be in the north pasture today, back at sundown. He paused at the door, seeming to consider something. There's bacon in the cold cellar, flour in the barrel by the stove. The words were offered, grudgingly, as if each one cost him something to give. After he left, Willa stood in the kitchen, absorbing the silence of the house. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of solitude, but something heavier, a silence that had weight and presence like a held breath. She understood then that she and her daughters weren't simply occupying an empty house. They were inhabiting the negative space left by Eleanor's absence, moving through the hollows carved by Silas's grief. The twins emerged from the pantry, sleep-tousled and quiet. Willa smiled at them with a brightness she didn't feel. How would you like bacon for breakfast? She asked, and was rewarded with their widening eyes. Meat had been scarce at Thomas's table, especially for the 3 unwelcome guests. As the morning progressed, Willa set herself to reclaiming the kitchen from neglect. She scrubbed surfaces dulled by grime, washed windows clouded with dust, organized shelves according to function rather than happenstance. The twins helped in their way, small hands eager for purpose. While Willa worked, her mind returned to the teacup on the high shelf, Eleanor's cup. She found herself creating a picture of the woman in her imagination, gentle-handed to use such delicate china, perhaps fair-haired and soft-spoken, the kind of woman who would bring refinement to this rough-hewn house. A woman unlike Willa herself, whose hands were calloused from work, whose voice had learned to be firm through necessity. By midday, the kitchen had begun to emerge from its cocoon of neglect. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, casting warm rectangles on the scrubbed floor. Willa had found dried herbs hanging forgotten in the pantry and had crushed some into a pot of beans, slowly simmering on the stove. The aroma filled the kitchen, with a promise of nourishment. While the twins napped, exhausted from the morning's activities, Willa ventured cautiously into the hallway. She told herself she was merely seeking cleaning supplies, but curiosity pulled her toward the closed doors she had not yet seen beyond. The first opened to reveal what was clearly Silas's bedroom, sparse and functional, the bed roughly made. She closed it quickly, unwilling to invade his privacy further. The second door resisted slightly, as if it had not been opened in some time. When it finally yielded, Willa's breath caught in her throat. Unlike the rest of the house, this room appeared suspended in time, preserved like an insect in amber. Her bedroom, clearly feminine in its appointments, a patchwork quilt on the bed, dried flowers in a vase on the dresser, a hairbrush with strands of pale hair still caught in the bristles. Eleanor's room. The knowledge settled in Willa's chest, like a stone. She should leave, close the door on this shrine to memory, but something held her in place. Her eyes were drawn to a small wooden box on the bedside table. Almost against her will, she crossed to it and lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of small treasures, a blue ribbon, a pressed wildflower, a child's drawing. Beneath these, something metallic gleamed. Willa's fingers brushed against cool silver, a pendant on a chain, intricately worked into the shape of a bird in flight. She lifted it, watching it catch the light. "What are you doing in here?" Silas's voice cracked like thunder in the quiet room. Willa spun around, the necklace still dangling from her fingers. He stood in the doorway, his face a storm cloud, body rigid with anger. Willa began, but words failed her. There was no explanation that would suffice. Silas crossed the room in 2 strides and snatched the necklace from her hand. "Get out," he said, voice low and dangerous. Willa retreated toward the door, shame burning her cheeks. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. This room is not to be touched. Not by you, not by anyone." His words were controlled, but barely. "Is that understood?" "Yes," Willa whispered, unable to meet his gaze. She slipped past him into the hallway, heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her, she heard the gentle click of the door closing, not slammed in anger, but secured with reverence. It was somehow more devastating. Back in the kitchen, Willa pressed her palms against the newly cleaned table, forcing herself to breathe evenly. She had violated a sacred space, crossed a boundary she had no right to cross. The tenuous arrangement that had offered her daughters shelter now seemed fragile as spun glass. When the twins woke, Willa occupied them with small tasks, her mind racing. Would Silas cast them out now? The thought of facing the winter wilderness again, with her children depending on her for survival, filled her with cold dread. The sun was beginning its descent when Willa heard the back door open. She straightened her spine, preparing herself for the worst. But Silas merely entered the kitchen, removed his coat, and seated himself at the table without a word about the earlier incident. Relief coursed through Willa, so powerful she nearly swayed with it. She served the meal, beans with the last of their bacon, cornbread made from his flour, in silence. The twins, sensing the tension, ate without their usual whispered conversations. It was only as Silas was finishing that he finally spoke. "You've changed things." His tone was neutral, observational rather than accusatory. Willa glanced around the kitchen, seeing it suddenly through his eyes, the reorganized shelves, the polished surfaces, the curtains washed and rehung. She had altered his world without permission. "I can put it back," she offered quietly. Silas was silent for so long that Willa thought he might not respond at all. Then he said, "No." Just that single syllable, but something in his voice had shifted. "It's fine." That night, after the twins were asleep, Willa sat by the kitchen window, watching moonlight transform the snowy landscape into a sea of silver. The encounter in Eleanor's room had revealed something essential about the household they now inhabited. They were living alongside a man who had built a mausoleum to his grief, who preserved a room as if its occupant might return at any moment to claim her possessions. Willa pressed her forehead against the cold glass, her breath creating ephemeral clouds that dissipated into nothingness. She wondered if there was room in this house for the living, or if it belonged irretrievably to ghosts. Days bled into one another as January deepened, the rhythm of life at the McCade Ranch establishing itself through routine and necessity. Willa rose before dawn each morning, coaxed warmth from the kitchen stove, and prepared breakfast that Silas ate in the same contemplative silence before disappearing to tend his cattle. The twins gradually relaxed into this new existence, their natural childish energy emerging like early spring shoots through winter soil. The pantry-turned bedroom slowly transformed under Willa's attentions. She had discovered a trunk of discarded curtains in a forgotten corner of the house and, with Silas's tacit permission, repurposed the fabric into quilts for the makeshift beds. A shelf that once held preserves now displayed the twins' small treasures: pretty stones, a bird's feather, a corn-husk doll Willa had fashioned one evening. The kitchen, too, underwent a metamorphosis. Willa had always believed that kitchens should be the heart of a home, and she poured this philosophy into the space. Dried herbs now hung in neat bundles from the ceiling beams, their subtle fragrance infusing the air. She had scrubbed the windows to clarity, allowing winter light to pool on the wooden table where the twins now practiced their letters each morning, tracing shapes in flour spread thin across the surface. Silas observed these changes with an expression Willa couldn't decipher. Not quite approval, but no longer the rigid resistance of those first days. Sometimes she would catch him watching the twins as they whispered together over some childish game, his eyes holding a faraway look that suggested he was seeing something, or someone, else entirely. On this particular morning, Willa was kneading bread dough, her hands working in the familiar rhythm that required no conscious thought. Through the window, she could see fresh snow falling, adding to the white blanket that already enveloped the landscape. The twins sat at the table, heads bent together over a piece of paper, drawing with the precious stub of pencil they had brought from their uncle's house. The back door opened with a gust of cold air, and Silas entered earlier than his usual midday appearance. Snow dusted his coat and hat, melting quickly in the kitchen's warmth. Willa looked up, a question in her eyes. "Storm's coming," he said by way of explanation. "Bad one. Animals are brought in close to the barn. Willa nodded, calculating what this might mean for their small household. "I'll make sure we have extra wood for the stove," she said. Silas removed his coat, hanging it on a peg by the door. For a moment he seemed about to say something more. Then his gaze fell on the twins and their drawing. Curiosity flickered across his features, a rare break in his stoic facade. "What are you making there?" he asked, his voice still rough but lacking its usual edge. The twins looked up in unison, startled by the direct address. They had maintained a wary distance from Silas these past weeks, speaking only when spoken to, which was seldom. Rosie, always the braver of the two, held up the paper. "It's our mama," she said. "She's making bread, see? And these are the flowers that will grow when spring comes." Silas stepped closer, examining the childish drawing with unexpected attentiveness. "You've given her very long arms," he observed, the faintest trace of amusement in his voice. "That's so she can hug us both at the same time," Ruthie explained seriously. Something shifted in Silas's expression then, a softening around the eyes that transformed his face. Without warning, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small packet wrapped in brown paper. "I brought these from town last week," he said, placing it on the table. "Thought you might have use for them." The twins unwrapped the package to reveal a set of colored pencils, not new, and certainly not a complete set, but a rainbow of possibilities compared to their single graphite stub. Their matching gasps of delight seemed to startle Silas, as if he'd forgotten the sound of childish joy. "Thank you, Mr. McCade," they chorused, the formal address incongruous with their beaming faces. Silas nodded once awkwardly and turned away, but Willa had seen it, the crack in his armor, the momentary connection. She returned to her bread dough, pressing and folding with renewed vigor, afraid that any acknowledgement might cause him to retreat again. The storm arrived that afternoon with a vengeance, hurling snow against the windows and moaning down the chimney like a restless spirit. By evening, the temperature had dropped so severely that frost formed intricate patterns on the inside of the glass. Willa kept the stove burning hot, but still the cold crept in through every crack and crevice of the old house. After dinner, a hearty stew that Willa had prepared in anticipation of the worsening weather, Silas remained at the kitchen table rather than retreating to his room, as was his custom. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes in their frames. "It'll be too cold in that pantry tonight," he said abruptly. "You and the girls can sleep in here closer to the stove." Willa looked up from the dishes she was washing, surprised by the consideration. "Thank you," she said simply. The twins had spread their drawings across the table, a colorful display that transformed the weathered wood. Silas regarded them with that same curious attention he had shown earlier. "You have quite a gift," he said to Rosie, indicating a particularly vivid depiction of what appeared to be a horse, though the proportions were wildly imaginative. Rosie beamed at the praise. "Do you have horses, Mr. McCade?" she asked, emboldened by his unexpected interest. "Two," he replied. "Work horses for ploughing and such." "Our papa promised us ponies once," Ruthie said wistfully, "before he went away to California." An uncomfortable silence followed this mention of their absent father. Willa tensed, uncertain how Silas would respond to this fragment of their history. "California," Silas repeated, his tone neutral. "Gold country." Willa nodded, focusing on drying a plate with unnecessary thoroughness. "Yes, 3 years ago now." "He said he'd send for us when he found his fortune," Rosie added, the childish faith in her voice a knife to Willa's heart. "But Mama says the letters must have gotten lost." Willa felt Silas's gaze on her but couldn't bring herself to meet it. The fiction of lost letters was a mercy she had created for her daughters, a shield against the harsher truth that James Carrigan had abandoned his family for golden dreams, leaving not even a forwarding address in his wake. "Letters get lost out here," Silas said after a moment, surprising Willa with this small kindness, the maintenance of a child's illusion. Later, with the twins asleep on pallets near the stove, Willa sat at the table, mending one of Ruthie's dresses by the light of a single lamp. Silas remained in his chair, whittling a piece of wood with a small knife, his hands moving with the sure confidence of long practice. The storm continued its assault on the house, but inside, the kitchen, was a pocket of warmth and unexpected peace. You never said why your brother turned you out, Silas remarked, breaking the companionable silence. Willa's needle paused mid-stitch. He married a woman who didn't want another woman's children underfoot, she said finally. And Thomas always did put his own comfort first. Silas considered this, his knife still moving steadily across the wood. Family should stand by family, he said, the statement simple but weighted with conviction. Yes, Willa agreed softly. They should. A comfortable silence fell between them again, broken only by the crackle of the stove and the persistent howl of the wind. Willa resumed her sewing, aware of a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the house. It was as if the storm enforcing them into this shared space had also broken some invisible barrier. "What are you making?" she asked, nodding toward his whittling. Silas turned the piece of wood in his hands, revealing the emerging shape, a small bird. Its wings caught in the moment of taking flight. "Just passing time," he said, but there was a care to his craftsmanship that belied the casual words. "It's beautiful," Willa offered. Silas's hands stilled, and he looked at the carving as if seeing it for the first time. "Eleanor collected them," he said, the words emerging with surprising ease. "Birds. Said they reminded her that there was always freedom to be found, even in this empty country." He traced a finger along the wooden wing, a gesture of such tenderness that Willa had to look away. "The pendant," she said softly, understanding dawning. "The silver bird in her room." Silas nodded, eyes still on the carving. "Anniversary gift. How a 10th?" He spoke of it without the anger that had marked their previous encounter in Eleanor's room, as if the memory now brought something besides pain. "You must have loved her very much," Willa said, the words inadequate but sincere. 17 years, Silas replied, the number both statement and explanation. Outside, the wind reached a crescendo, throwing itself against the house in a fury of white. Inside, something fragile was taking root in the shared warmth of the kitchen. Not friendship exactly, but understanding. A recognition of wounds carried and the courage required to bear them. Willa returned to her mending and Silas to his carving, each absorbed in their separate tasks, yet connected by the simple fact of being two souls weathering the same storm. The wooden bird took shape beneath his hands, its wings outstretched in perpetual flight, captured in the moment of becoming free. February arrived with a brief reprieve from winter's harshest grip. The sun emerged from behind perpetual clouds, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape, but bringing a welcome warmth that caused icicles to drip from the eaves in a steady rhythm. Willa stood at the kitchen window, watching as Silas led the twins across the yard toward the barn, their small figures flanking his tall one-like paired exclamation marks beside a solid pillar. The change had come gradually, Silas including the girls in small tasks, teaching them to scatter feed for the chickens, allowing them to watch as he repaired harnesses or mended fences. Today, he had offered to show them the new calf born during the night, and their excited chatter had filled the kitchen at breakfast. The house felt different now, still permeated with memory, still holding Eleanor's absence in its corners, but no longer a mausoleum. Life had crept back in through the cracks, in the twins' laughter, in the smells of cooking that now regularly filled the kitchen, in the small changes Willa had introduced with increasingly confident hands. She had expanded her domain beyond the kitchen and pantry, with Silas's tacit permission. The sitting room sheets had been removed, furniture polished, floors swept. She'd found a box of Eleanor's needlework, and after asking Silas if she might use the materials, had begun fashioning new curtains for windows long left bare. It gave her hands purpose in the evenings, when the twins were asleep and the house fell into that peculiar quiet that invited contemplation. Often during these evening hours, Silas would join her in the sitting room, sometimes reading from one of the few books in the house, sometimes simply sitting in companionable silence. Occasionally he would share fragments of his life with Eleanor, small, polished stories offered like pebbles from a private collection. Willa received these offerings with care, understanding their value. In return, she shared pieces of her own history, her childhood in Missouri, her marriage to James at 17, the early years of hope before gold fever had taken him. She spoke of these things matter-of-factly, without self-pity, but Silas seemed to hear the undercurrents of pain beneath her measured words. "You're strong," he had said one night, the observation unexpected. Willa had looked up from her needlework. Startled. "Necessity," she'd replied with a small shrug. "When there's no choice but to endure, you endure." Silas had nodded, a recognition passing between them, two people who understood what it meant to continue when continuing seemed impossible. Now, watching him with her daughters through the window, Willa felt a complicated emotion take root in her chest, gratitude intertwined with something more fragile, something she was not yet ready to name. She turned back to the dough she was kneading, pushing the feeling down like air pockets in the flour. The door opened, bringing a rush of cold air and childish excitement. The twins burst into the kitchen, faces flushed with cold and wonder. "Mama! The calf has a white star on its forehead," Rosie exclaimed, tugging at Willa's apron. "And Mr. McCade let us touch it," Ruthie added, her eyes wide with the privilege. Silas followed more sedately, stomping snow from his boots at the threshold. His expression held none of the girl's animation, but Willa had learned to read the subtle signs of his mood, the slight relaxation around his eyes, the less rigid set of his shoulders. He was, she realized with surprise, enjoying himself. "Sounds like quite an adventure," Willa said, smiling at her daughters. "Now wash up and help me with these biscuits." The twins scampered to obey, their energy seemingly inexhaustible. Silas moved to his usual place at the table, but instead of immediately departing for his outdoor tasks, he remained, watching the domestic scene with an expression Willa couldn't quite interpret. "Town tomorrow," he said abruptly. "Need supplies." Willa nodded, mentally cataloguing what they were running low on: flour, coffee, salt. "I can make a list," she offered. "Thought you might want to come along," Silas continued, his tone casual but his eyes watchful. "You and the girls, been cooped up here for weeks now." The offer took Willa by surprise. She had not left the ranch. Since their arrival, had almost forgotten there was a world beyond these snow-covered acres. The prospect of town, of other faces, other voices, was both appealing and somehow intimidating after so long in isolation. "That would be nice," she said finally. "Thank you." Silas nodded once, as if concluding a business transaction, then rose to leave. At the door he paused. "Weather should hold, we'll take the sled." And then he was gone, back to his chores. The twins, who had been listening to this exchange with undisguised interest, erupted in excitement. "Town! Will there be a store, Mama, with candy?" Rosie asked, already imagining the possibilities. "And other children?" Ruthie added hopefully. Willa smiled at their enthusiasm. "Yes, to the store, though we're going for necessities, not treats," she cautioned. "And I don't know about other children. It's a small settlement, not like Cheyenne." Nevertheless, the prospect of the outing infused the day with anticipation. The twins were extra diligent with their chores, as if good behavior might ensure the trip would not be cancelled. Willa found herself also looking forward to the change of scenery, though a small anxiety gnawed at her. How would she be received in town? What would people think of her presence at the McCade Ranch? That evening, as she prepared for bed, Willa examined her reflection in the small mirror she'd found in a drawer. The face that looked back at her was thinner than she remembered, with new lines etched around the eyes and mouth. Her hair, once her pride with its thick chestnut waves, now hung limp and dull. She had no fine clothes to wear to town, only the same two dresses she'd been alternating since their arrival, both showing signs of wear despite her careful mending. Vanity, she chided herself, turning away from the mirror. What did it matter? How she looked? The trip was for supplies, not social calls, yet still, a feminine part of her wished for something prettier than her faded calico to wear for her first appearance in the community. Morning brought clear skies and mild temperatures, as mild as February in Wyoming Territory could be. Silas had the sled ready after breakfast, the two workhorses harnessed and stomping impatiently. The twins, bundled in every layer they possessed, could barely contain their excitement, running back and forth between house and sled, until Willa called them to order. "You two will ride in the back with the supplies on the return trip," she instructed, helping them climb onto the wooden bench beside Silas. She took her own place at the end, maintaining a proper distance between herself and their host, conscious Suddenly of appearances. The journey to town took nearly an hour, the sled cutting smooth tracks through pristine snow. The twins peppered Silas with questions about landmarks they passed, and to Willa's surprise, he answered with patience, pointing out features of the landscape and occasionally sharing anecdotes from his early days in the territory. That ridge, there, he said, indicating a rocky outcropping to the east, was where I shot my first elk, nearly froze waiting for it, but Eleanor insisted we needed the meat for winter. Was Mrs. McCade a good hunter too? Rosie asked innocently. A shadow passed over Silas's face, but he answered evenly, no, but she was braver than most men I knew, faced down a wolf once that was after our chickens, nothing but a broom in her hands and pure determination. Willa tried to reconcile this image of the brave frontierswoman with the delicate teacup. In the kitchen, Eleanor McCade, it seemed, had contained multitudes, gentility and grit in equal measure. The town, when they reached it, was little more than a cluster of buildings strung along a single muddy street. A general store, a smithy, a saloon, and a handful of houses comprised the entirety of the settlement. Yet after weeks at the isolated ranch, it seemed bustling with activity. Silas pulled the sled to a stop outside the general store. I'll see. To grain and feed first, he said, helping the twins down from the bench. You can get whatever else we need in Holloway's here. Willa nodded, suddenly self-conscious as she noticed curious eyes turning in their direction from the store's porch, where several men had paused in their conversation to observe the new arrivals. Inside the store, the twins stayed close to Willa's skirts, overwhelmed by the relative wealth of goods after their confined existence. Mr. Holloway, a corpulent man with shrewd eyes beneath bushy brows, watched them with undisguised curiosity as Willa selected flour, coffee, and other necessities. You're staying out at McCade's place, he said finally. Not a question, but a statement laden with unspoken implications. Yes, Willa replied simply, meeting his gaze with a directness that belied her discomfort. My daughters and I are helping with the household. Holloway's eyebrows rose slightly. Didn't know Silas was looking for help, he remarked, measuring coffee beans with deliberate slowness. Man's kept to himself these past 3 years, barely comes to town except when absolutely necessary. Willa made a non-committal sound, unwilling to be drawn into gossip about their host. She was aware of other customers in the store now, their attention not quite direct but palpable nonetheless. Mama, look. Ruthie tugged at her skirt, pointing to a display of hair ribbons in various colors. They're like the ones in your sewing box. Not now, sweetheart, Willa murmured, conscious of the listening ears and watching eyes. Those your girls? A woman's voice came from behind her, pleasant but sharp with curiosity. Willa turned to find herself facing a small bird-like woman with keen eyes. I'm Martha Holloway. My husband runs the store. Willa Carrigan, Willa replied, inclining her head slightly. And yes, these are my daughters, Rosie and Ruthie. Martha's gaze moved between the twins and Willa, assessing. Twins. That's a blessing. And a trial, I expect. You're new to these parts. We arrived in January, Willa confirmed, keeping her tone neutral. From my brother's homestead near Laramie. Martha nodded as if filing away this information. And now you're keeping house for Silas McCade. The slight pause carried volumes of insinuation. Heat rose to Willa's cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. Yes, Mr. McCade has been kind enough to provide shelter in exchange for household help. Has he now? Martha's tone suggested she found this arrangement unusual, perhaps improper. Well, I'm sure it's a comfort to him having life in that house again. Been like a tomb since Eleanor passed. Before Willa could respond, the store door opened, admitting Silas along with a gust of cold air. The conversation died immediately, leaving an awkward silence in its wake. Silas surveyed the scene with a quick glance, his expression unreadable as he approached the counter. Got everything? He asked Willa, seemingly oblivious to the tension in the air. Almost, she replied, grateful for his presence despite the complications it introduced. As Holloway tallied their purchases, the twins drifted back to the display of ribbons, their longing evident in their posture. Silas followed their gaze, then looked to Willa with a questioning expression. They're fine without, Willa said quietly. The ribbons were an unnecessary expense, a frivolity they couldn't afford. To her surprise, Silas turned to Holloway. "Add 2 of those ribbons," he said, "the blue ones." The twins' faces lit with delight, and they turned identical grateful smiles on Silas. Martha Holloway watched this interaction with narrow-eyed interest, her lips pursed in what might have been disapproval. Outside, as they loaded their purchases, onto the sled, Willa became aware of whispers following them. Quiet conversations that ceased when she glanced in their direction, only to resume once she turned away. The town was forming opinions, drawing conclusions about the nature of their arrangement at the McCade Ranch. The return journey began in silence, the twins subdued by the unfamiliar experience of town and the obvious scrutiny they had endured. Willa sat stiffly on the bench, her thoughts in turmoil. She had not considered how their living situation might appear to others, had been too focused on immediate survival to worry about propriety or reputation. "They talk," Silas said finally, breaking the silence. "Not much else to do out here in winter." Willa glanced at him, surprised by this acknowledgement of the undercurrents she had felt in town. "Yes," she agreed cautiously. "Does it bother you?" he asked, eyes fixed on the snowy path ahead. Willa considered the question honestly. "Not for myself," she said finally, "but for the girls where children can be cruel to those who are different, whose situations aren't conventional." Silas nodded, absorbing this. "We're not doing anything wrong," he said, the statement firm but with a questioning note beneath it, as if seeking confirmation. "No," Willa agreed softly. "We're not." They lapsed into silence again, but it was a different quality of quiet now, thoughtful rather than strained. The twins, tired from the excitement of the day, leaned against each other in the back of the sled, their new blue ribbons clutched in small hands. As the McCade Ranch came into view, outlined against the setting sun, Willa felt a surprising sense of homecoming. Despite the complications introduced by their trip to town, despite the whispers and curious glances, this place had become a sanctuary of sorts. Here, they had found not just shelter, but the beginnings of something she had thought lost forever: security, routine, say, and perhaps, though she was afraid to name it even to herself, belonging. The house welcomed them with silent stoicism, unchanged by their brief absence. Yet as they carried supplies inside, as the twins excitedly recounted their adventures, to no one in particular, as Silas built up the fire against the evening chill, Willa felt the shift that had occurred within her. This was no longer just a temporary haven, a port in the storm of their circumstances. Somehow, when she wasn't looking, it had begun to feel like home. March arrived with the capricious temperament of early spring in Wyoming territory, days of tantalizing warmth, followed by bitter reminders that winter had not yet relinquished its grip. The snow retreated gradually, revealing patches of muddy earth that promised renewal but delivered mostly mess. Yet even in this transitional ugliness, signs of change were evident. On one such day, when the sun had maintained its presence, long enough to melt the latest dusting of snow, Willa stood at the edge of what had once been Eleanor's kitchen garden. It was little more than a rectangular plot of earth now, bordered by weathered wooden planks, but Willa could see its potential. She knelt, pushing her fingers into the soil, testing its readiness. Still cold, but yielding, like so many things. At the McCade Ranch, "It needs work," Silas's voice came from behind her, causing her to start slightly. She hadn't heard his approach. "Yes," she agreed, brushing dirt from her hands as she stood. "But the bones are good. With some attention, it could produce well this summer." Silas surveyed the plot, his expression thoughtful. "Eleanor grew tomatoes here, and beans. Some herbs I never learned the names of." Willa nodded, envisioning the space transformed. "I could do the same if you'd like. Maybe add squash along the fence where they can climb. The girls would enjoy helping." Something flickered across Silas's face then. Hesitation, perhaps, or uncertainty. "You're thinking of staying, then? Through summer?" The question caught Willa off guard. They had never discussed the duration of the arrangement, had allowed it to exist in a state of unexamined temporality. The initial understanding, shelter in exchange for household help, had evolved into something more complex and undefined. "I hadn't thought," she began, then stopped, reconsidering. "Would that be agreeable to you?" Silas looked away toward the distant hills where green was just beginning to assert itself against the browns and greys of winter. "This place," he said finally. "It's different with you and the girls here, less—" He searched for the word. "Empty," Willa suggested gently. "Hollow," he corrected, meeting her eyes again. "Less hollow." The admission hung between them, simple but profound. Willa felt its weight, understood what it had cost this private man to speak it aloud. "Then we'd like to stay," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "If you'll have us." Silas nodded once, the gesture containing volumes of unspoken emotion. Then, with characteristic practicality, he gestured to the garden plot. "I'll bring manure from the barn, help you turn the soil." And so it was settled, their continued presence at the ranch, the planting of a garden, the implicit acknowledgement that what had begun as temporary shelter had grown roots like the seedlings Willa would soon nurture. The weeks that followed brought a flurry of activity as the land awoke from its winter slumber. Silas was busy from dawn to dusk with spring carving, often returning to the house exhausted, but with a satisfaction that hadn't been present during the more confining winter months. Willa divided her time between household duties and preparations for the garden, while the twins explored their expanding world with the resilience of childhood. One evening, as Willa sat at the kitchen table mending one of Silas's shirts, she became aware of his gaze on her hands. She paused, needle suspended mid-stitch. "Is something wrong?" Silas shook his head slightly. "Your hands," he said. "They're rougher than they were." Willa glanced down at her hands, work reddened, calloused, the nails cut short for practicality. "Yes," she acknowledged. "Garden work does that." "I have something," Silas said abruptly, rising from his chair. He disappeared down the hallway, returning moments later with a small glass jar. "Eleanor made it. For her hands." He placed it on the table between them, an offering. Willa regarded the jar with surprise. It was another piece of Eleanor, another fragment of the woman whose absence still shaped this household. "Are you sure?" she asked, understanding the significance. Silas nodded. "She'd want it used, not sitting on a shelf gathering dust." Willa removed the lid carefully, releasing the faint scent of lavender and beeswax. She dipped a finger into the balm, applied a small amount to her chapped knuckles. The soothing effect was immediate. "Thank you," she said simply. Silas resumed his seat, picking up the book he'd been reading, but Willa noticed he kept glancing at her hands as she worked, watching as she smoothed the balm into her skin. It was a small moment, insignificant perhaps, in the grand scheme of things, but it felt like a milestone in their evolving relationship. The sharing of something that had belonged solely to Eleanor now passed into Willa's care. The garden progressed under Willa's attentive hands. Seeds were planted in neat rows marked with small stakes. The twins were enlisted for watering duties, which they approached with solemn importance. Silas contributed in his own way, constructing a low fence to protect the tender shoots from rabbits and other wildlife. One Saturday, nearly a month after their trip to town, Silas announced at breakfast that he needed to return for additional supplies. "Thought the girls might like to come along again," he added, glancing at the twins, who immediately erupted in excitement. "Can we, Mama?" Rosie pleaded, her eyes wide with anticipation. "Please," Ruthie added, not to be outdone. Willa hesitated, remembering the whispers and curious glances of their previous visit. "Perhaps I should stay behind this time," she suggested. "I have bread to bake and the garden needs attention." Silas regarded her steadily, understanding more than she had said aloud. "Town talks," he acknowledged, "but they'll talk whether you're there or not. Might as well give them something worth talking about." The unexpected humor in his tone surprised a laugh from Willa. "You make a compelling argument, Mr. McCade." And so they went, all four together, in the wagon now that the roads had dried sufficiently for wheel travel. The journey was pleasant. In the spring sunshine, the landscape transformed from the monochrome palette of winter to the vibrant greens and golds of awakening nature. The twins chattered happily, pointing out wildflowers and birds with exuberant enthusiasm. Town, when they arrived, seemed less intimidating than it had in February. The muddy main street was beginning to dry, and more people were visible, going about their business in the pleasant weather. As before, their arrival attracted attention, but Willa held her head high, determined not to be cowed by curiosity or judgment. In the general store, she selected their supplies with efficient care while the twins explored the shelves with wide-eyed wonder. Mr. Holloway was less obviously inquisitive this time, though his wife appeared as if by magic when they were nearly finished with their purchases. "Mrs. Carrigan," Martha Holloway greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I see you've all settled in at the McCade place." "Yes," Willa replied pleasantly. "We're quite comfortable there." Martha's gaze flicked to where Silas stood examining tools at the far end of the store. "It's good to see Silas in town more often," she remarked. "He kept himself too isolated after Eleanor's passing. Not healthy for a man to be alone with his grief that way." Willa made a non-committal sound, unwilling to discuss Silas's grief with this near stranger. "Of course," Martha continued, lowering her voice confidentially. "There are those who think it's too soon. That he's dishonoring Eleanor's memory." Anger flared in Willa's chest, hot and unexpected. "Mr. McCade has shown nothing but respect for his late wife's memory," she said, her tone cool but firm, "and great kindness to my daughters and me in our time of need." Martha's eyebrows rose at this defense. Of course," she backpedaled slightly. "I'm merely telling you what others are saying, as a friend would." "Then I thank you for your friendship," Willa replied. The word weighted with irony. "But I assure you our arrangement is one of mutual benefit and perfect propriety." Before Martha could respond, the twins appeared at Willa's side, eyes fixed on a display of hard candy in glass jars. "Mama, look!" Rosie whispered, awestruck by the colorful array. Grateful for the interruption, Willa turned her attention to her daughters. "One piece each," she said, conscious of the need to manage their expectations against limited resources. "Allow me," Silas's voice came from behind them. He had approached without Willa noticing, had perhaps overheard part of her conversation with Martha. "2 pieces each," he amended, meeting Willa's eyes with a look that brooked no argument, the E. Twins' faces lit with delight as they carefully selected their treats. Martha Holloway watched this domestic scene with calculating eyes, clearly filing away details for later dissemination among the town gossips. Outside, as they loaded their purchases into the wagon, a tall, lean man approached them. His clothes marked him as a rancher, though of more prosperous means than Silas, and his bearing suggested a man accustomed to authority. "McCade," he greeted, his tone neutral but not friendly. "Hargrove," Silas returned, quali reserved. The man, Hargrove, shifted his attention to Willa and the twins. His assessment was not unkind but carried a weight of judgment that made Willa stand straighter, chin lifted slightly in unconscious defiance. "Heard you had visitors," Hargrove remarked to Silas. "Didn't realize they'd become permanent fixtures." "Mrs. Carrigan and her daughters are staying at my invitation," Silas replied, his voice level but with an undercurrent of steel that Willa had rarely heard. "For as long as they choose." Hargrove's eyebrows rose slightly. "That so?" He turned to Willa directly. "Ma'am, you should know that Silas McCade's property borders mine to the north. That stream you're drawing water from feeds my cattle downstream. I've had concerns about its use for some time." Willa recognized the veiled threat for what it was, not about water rights at all, but about their presence on Silas's land. "Mr. Hargrove," she replied, keeping her voice steady, "I'm sure any concerns about water usage can be addressed civilly between neighbors." "Neighbors," Hargrove repeated, as if testing the word. "Well, that remains to be seen, doesn't it?" With a tip of his hat that managed to be both polite and dismissive, he turned and walked away. The journey home was subdued, the earlier light-heartedness dampened by the encounters in town. The twins, sensitive to the change in atmosphere despite their enjoyment of the candy, spoke in whispers rather than their usual exuberant tones. "Who is that man?" Willa asked, finally breaking the silence. "Jacob Hargrove," Silas replied, eyes on the road ahead. "Owns the largest spread in the county. Thinks that gives him the right to dictate to everyone else." "And the water dispute?" Silas glanced at her briefly. There is no dispute. The stream runs through my property before it reaches his. I have every right to use it. Willa nodded, understanding that the confrontation had been about establishing boundaries of a different sort. He doesn't approve of our presence, she stated rather than asked. No, Silas agreed, but his approval isn't required. They rode in silence for a while longer, the wagon wheels creating a steady rhythm on the packed earth. The twins had fallen, asleep in the back, lulled by the motion and the warm spring sun. What Martha Holloway said, Willa began hesitantly, about dishonoring Eleanor's memory. Silas's hands tightened on the reins, but his voice remained even. Eleanor would have been the first to offer shelter to a woman and children in need, he said. She had a generous heart, more generous than most in that town could understand. Willa absorbed this, another piece of the Eleanor puzzle slotting into place. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was, Silas affirmed, but the words held a different quality now, acknowledgement of loss rather than the raw grief that had been present when Willa first arrived. As the ranch came into view, Willa was struck again by how much it had transformed in the months since their arrival. The house, once a weathered sentinel on the plain, now showed signs of care, curtains in windows that had been bare, the beginnings of the garden adding color to the yard, a clothesline from which sheets flapped in the spring breeze like welcoming flags. Home looks well, Silas remarked, echoing her thoughts with uncanny precision. Yes, Willa agreed softly. It does. That evening, after the twins were asleep, Willa sat on the porch steps, watching as the last light faded from the western sky. The air was cool but not uncomfortable, fragrant with the scent of earth awakening after winter's long sleep. She heard the door open behind her, felt rather than saw Silas join her on the step. They'll talk regardless, he said after a moment, continuing their earlier conversation as if no time had passed. Townfolk. It's what they do. Yes, Willa agreed, drawing her shawl closer around her shoulders. Does it trouble you? Willa considered the question honestly. Not for myself, she said finally. I've faced worse than wagging tongues, but for the girls. She hesitated. And for you. Your standing in the community, my standing, Silas interrupted gently, is of no concern. To me. Never has been. They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching as stars emerged in the darkening sky. A coyote called in the distance, its lonely voice echoing across the plain. I've been thinking, Silas said finally, his voice low and measured, about Eleanor's room. Willa glanced at him, surprised by this turn in the conversation. The room had remained untouched, a shrine to memory that neither of them had mentioned since that first uncomfortable encounter. It should be used, he continued. Not just preserved. The girls need a proper place to sleep, not that pantry floor. The suggestion took Willa's breath away. It represented a monumental shift, an acknowledgement that life continued, that the present had claims as valid as the past. Are you certain? She asked softly. Silas nodded, his profile strong against the starlit sky. Eleanor would want it that way, he said simply. She filled that room with life it should be filled again. Willa reached out impulsively, covering his weathered hand with her own. Thank you, she whispered, the words inadequate for the gift he was offering, not just the physical space but the emotional territory it represented. Silas turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers intertwining with a naturalness that belied the significance of the gesture. They sat thus connected, watching as the night deepened around them, the ranch house a solid presence at their backs, no longer just a structure of wood and nails, but a home being rebuilt from the inside out, like a garden coaxed back to life. After a long, hard winter, April unfolded across the Wyoming landscape like a hesitant smile, bringing longer days and the first tentative wildflowers to the plains surrounding the McCade Ranch. Inside the house, an equally significant transformation was underway. Eleanor's room, long preserved as a memorial, was being gently reclaimed for the living. Willa approached the task with reverence and care, understanding the emotional weight it carried for Silas. The first day, she had stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the space that had been Eleanor's sanctuary, the patchwork quilt on the bed, the brush still holding strands of pale hair, the collection of small treasures on the bedside table. These were not just possessions, but physical manifestations of a life, tangible remnants of a woman Willa had never met, but whose presence she felt throughout the house. "I don't know where to begin," she had admitted to Silas, who stood beside her, his face composed but his eyes revealing the cost of this concession. "Eleanor kept a trunk," he'd replied, crossing to the wardrobe and opening it to reveal a large cedar chest. "For keepsakes, important things." Together they had sorted through Eleanor's belongings, deciding what should be preserved in the trunk and what could be repurposed or set aside. It was an intimate process, this cataloguing of another woman's life, and Willa found herself developing a peculiar connection to Eleanor through her possessions: the well-worn Bible with passages underlined in a delicate hand, the collection of pressed wildflowers labeled with dates and locations, the half-finished embroidery still held taut in its hoop. "She was working on this the week before she fell ill," Silas had said, running a finger along the colourful threads that formed part of a garden scene. "Said she wanted to finish it before the real garden started needing attention." "It's beautiful," Willa had observed, noting the precise stitches and vibrant colours. "She was very talented." "She was," Silas had agreed, a note of pride mixing with the sorrow in his voice. "Taught herself from a book. Same way she learned about gardening, about doctoring animals. Eleanor believed anything could be learned if you had the right book and enough determination." Now, a week into the transformation, the room was taking on a new character, while still honouring its previous occupant. The furniture remained the same, but the bed had been moved to accommodate two small ones for the twins. Eleanor's quilt had been carefully folded and stored in the trunk, replaced by simpler coverings better suited to active children. Her personal items had been gathered and preserved, but the surfaces now held the twins' small treasures. Pretty. Stones, feathers, the cornhusk dolls Willa had made for them. The twins had approached their new bedroom with a combination of excitement and reverence. Willa had explained in terms they could understand that the room had belonged to Mrs. McCade, who had gone to heaven, and that they should treat it with respect. They had nodded solemnly, understanding in their childish way the significance of the space they were being given. "Was Mrs. McCade pretty?" Rosie had asked, running a small hand along the carved footboard of what was now her bed. "I believe she was," Willa had answered truthfully. "Mr. McCade doesn't have a photograph, but from the things he's told me, she was lovely." "Did she have little girls like us?" Ruthie had wondered, her face serious with the question. Willa had hesitated, uncertain of this part of Eleanor's history. "I don't know, sweetheart. That's a question for Mr. McCade if you feel brave enough to ask him." But the twins, for all their growing comfort with Silas, had not pursued the question. Some instinct perhaps told them it might open wounds better left undisturbed. This morning, as Willa hung freshly laundered curtains at the bedroom window, she heard the twins in the yard, their voices raised in a game of their own invention. Through the glass she could see them running in circles around Silas, who was mending a section of fence. He paused in his work occasionally to answer air questions or acknowledge their games with a nod, his manner more patient than Willa would have thought possible when they first arrived. A sound behind her drew Willa's attention, a creak from the floorboard near the doorway. She turned, expecting to find one of the twins, but the doorway was empty. A chill ran down her spine despite the warm spring air filtering through the window. It was not the first time she had experienced such a sensation in this room, a feeling of being watched, of a presence just beyond the edge of perception. Willa was not a superstitious woman. Hard experience had taught her to trust in tangible realities, the work of her hands, the needs of her children, the concrete challenges of survival. Yet in this house, surrounded by the echoes of Eleanor's life, she sometimes found herself wondering if more than memory lingered in the shadows. She shook off the unsettling feeling and finished hanging the curtains, simple muslin that she had hemmed by hand, a practical replacement for the faded floral ones that now rested in the cedar trunk. As she smoothed the fabric into place, her fingers brushed against something caught in the window frame. A small piece of paper, yellowed with age, folded and tucked into a crevice where the wood had warped slightly. Curiosity overcame her initial hesitation. Willa carefully extracted the paper and unfolded it to reveal a note written in a delicate, flowing hand. My dearest S. Today marks 7 years in this house that has become our home. The winters are hard, the work never ending, but I would choose this life with you 1,000 times over. When I look out this window at the land we are taming together, I see not just the present struggles but the future we are building. The garden that will flourish, the trees that will grow tall, the life we will continue to shape with our own hands. All my love. Willa refolded the note with careful fingers, a lump forming in her throat. It was a glimpse into the heart of the woman who had loved Silas, who had seen beauty and possibility in this harsh landscape, who had created a home from wilderness through sheer determination and love. Mama, Mr. McCade says we can help plant corn tomorrow. Rosie burst into the room, her face flushed with excitement, breaking the spell of the moment. He says we're big enough to make the holes for the seeds. That's wonderful, sweetheart, Willa replied, quickly tucking the note into her pocket. She would give it to Silas later, this precious fragment of his past that had been hidden away like a secret, waiting to be discovered. That evening, after the twins were asleep in their new beds, Willa joined Silas on the porch where he sat smoking his pipe and watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. It had become a habit of sorts, this shared quiet at day's end, a peaceful interlude before sleep claimed them. The room is finished, she said, settling onto the step beside him. The twins are delighted with it. Silas nodded, the ember of his pipe glowing briefly as he drew on it. You've done well with it, he acknowledged. Made it right. Willa understood what he meant, that she had managed the delicate balance between honoring the past and serving the present. I found something today, she said after a moment, reaching into her pocket for the folded note. It was tucked into the window frame behind the curtain rod. She held it out to him, watched as he took it with careful fingers, noted the recognition that flickered across his face as he unfolded it, and saw the handwriting. He read in silence, the planes of his face softened by the fading light and perhaps by memory. Our 7th anniversary, he said finally, his voice low and textured with emotion. Eleanor had a way with words that I never did. She left notes, like this sometimes, in my coat pocket under my pillow, places she knew I'd find them. Willa remained silent, sensing that he needed space to continue if he chose. She wanted children, Silas said after a long pause, surprising her with this confidence. And we tried for years. There was a baby once, but it came too early. After that, the doctor in Cheyenne said there wouldn't be others. He tapped the ash from his pipe, a deliberate movement that seemed to ground him. Eleanor said God had other plans for us, that we'd make our mark on the world in different ways. Willa thought of the twins asleep in what had been Eleanor's room, their small bodies curled beneath blankets in the space where this woman had dreamed of children who never came. She would have been a wonderful mother, she said softly. Silas nodded, refolding the note with careful precision. Yes, he agreed simply. Then, after a moment, she would have liked you, I think, and the girls. The statement, offered with quiet certainty, warmed Willa in a way she hadn't expected. I wish I could have known her, she replied honestly. They sat in companionable silence for a time, each absorbed in their own thoughts. The night was clear, the stars extraordinarily bright in the vast Wyoming sky. From somewhere in the distance came the haunting call of a coyote, answered by another further away, lonely voices finding each other across the emptiness. The garden's coming along well, Silas remarked eventually, changing the subject to more comfortable terrain. Saw the first bean sprouts today. Yes, Willa agreed, allowing him this retreat from emotional vulnerability. And the tomato seedlings are strong. We should have a good crop if the weather holds. It will, Silas said with the confidence of a man who had read the rhythms of this land for many years. Going to be a good summer. The simple prediction carried more weight than its words alone suggested, a looking forward rather than backward, an acknowledgement of future possibility. Willa found herself hoping he was right, not just about the weather, but about the season that stretched before them, full of potential like the seedlings pushing through soil toward sunlight. Later, as she prepared for bed in the small room off the kitchen that she had claimed as her own, Willa thought about the note and what it revealed about Eleanor, her love for Silas, her commitment to this difficult life, her ability to find joy in the midst of hardship. In some strange way, Willa felt a kinship with this woman she had never met, as if their lives were threads in the same tapestry, connected across time by the common experiences of womanhood and survival on this unforgiving frontier. As she drifted toward sleep, Willa imagined she heard a floorboard creak in the hallway outside her door, not the heavy tread of Silas's boots, but something lighter, more tentative. For a moment, hovering on the edge of consciousness, she had the peculiar sense that Eleanor was walking the house as she must have done in life, checking on its occupants with a mother's vigilance, despite having no children of her own. "I'm caring for them," Willa thought drowsily, the message directed toward the presence she sensed or imagined. "For all of them. I promise." Whether it was her overtired mind playing tricks or something more mysterious, Willa felt a gentle touch on her forehead as sleep claimed her, a benediction perhaps, or a passing of the torch from one woman to another, across the divide that separated life from whatever came after. May arrived with a suddenness that transformed the landscape overnight, as if winter had finally surrendered its last hold on the Wyoming plains. The ranch bloomed under the influence of longer days and warmer temperatures, grass greening in the pastures, wildflowers dotting the hillsides, the garden flourishing under Willa's attentive care. With the change in season came a shift in the household's rhythm, a moving outward after the contained intimacy of the colder months. Silas spent long days working the land, preparing for summer grazing, mending fences damaged by winter storms, and tending to the new calves. The twins, released from the confines of the house, followed him like devoted shadows whenever Willa allowed it, their small figures visible across the pastures as they helped with chores or simply observed the workings of the ranch with endless curiosity. Willa divided her time between household duties and the garden, which grew more promising with each passing day. She had begun to think ahead to harvest time, mentally cataloguing the preserving jars stored in the root cellar, planning for a bounty that would see them through the next winter. It was, she realized with some surprise, the first time since James's departure that she had allowed herself to think so far into the future, to plan beyond immediate survival. On this particular morning, she stood at the kitchen sink, washing breakfast dishes while watching through the window as Silas showed the twins how to check for eggs in the chicken coop. The sight warmed her, his tall frame bent toward their small ones, his weather-roughened hands guiding theirs with unexpected gentleness, the serious attention with which he answered their endless questions. A sound from the yard drew her attention, the approach of a horse and rider, an unusual occurrence at the isolated ranch. Willa dried her hands quickly and stepped onto the porch as Jacob Hargrove, the rancher they had encountered in town, dismounted near the gate. "Mrs. Carrigan," he greeted her, removing his hat with a politeness that seemed at odds with the wariness in his eyes. "Is McCade about?" "Mr. McCade is with my daughters by the chicken coop," Willa replied, matching his formality. "I can fetch him for you?" "No need," Hargrove said, replacing his hat. "I'll walk over. Nice day for it." Willa watched as he crossed the yard, noting the deliberate way he surveyed the property, assessing, evaluating, his gaze lingering on the flourishing garden and the newly repaired barn door. There was something proprietary in his attention that set her teeth on edge, though she couldn't have explained why. From her vantage point, she saw the moment Silas noticed their visitor, the immediate straightening of his posture, the protective gesture with which he positioned himself slightly in front of the twins. The men exchanged words she couldn't hear. Then Silas directed the girls toward the house with a gentle pat on their shoulders. They came running to Willa, faces flushed with excitement over their egg-collecting adventure, but eyes wide with curiosity about the visitor. "Who is that man, Mama?" Ruthie asked, clutching a still-warm egg in her small hands. "Mr. Hargrove," Willa explained, ushering them inside. "He owns the ranch that borders ours to the north." "Ours," Rosie repeated, latching onto the pronoun, with a child's unerring instinct for significant details. "So this is our home now, truly?" The innocent question caught Willa off guard. She had used the word without thinking, a slip that revealed more about her feelings than she had been ready to acknowledge. "Well," she hedged, "it's Mr. McCade's ranch, but he's kind enough to let us stay here." "But you said ours," Rosie persisted, her young face serious. Willa was saved from responding by the sound of raised voices from the yard, not quite shouting, but tense enough to carry to the porch where they stood. She directed the twins to the kitchen table with their eggs, then moved to the edge of the porch, concern drawing her closer to the men's conversation. "Not about the water rights, and you know it, McCade," Hargrove was saying, his tone heated. "It's about what's proper, what's respectful to Eleanor's memory." "Eleanor's memory is not your concern," Silas replied, his voice controlled but with an edge Willa had rarely heard. "Nor is what happens on my property. It becomes the community's concern when you bring a woman of questionable background into your home," Hargrove countered, "with 2 fatherless girls, no less. What kind of example does that set? What kind of talk does it generate?" Willa felt heat rise to her face, anger and humiliation in equal measure. That her private circumstances, her children's parentage, should be discussed so callously by a stranger was more than she could bear in silence. Before she could consider the wisdom of her actions, she was moving across the yard toward the men. "Mr. Hargrove," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "If you have concerns about my character or my children's heritage, perhaps you should address them to me directly, rather than maligning us to Mr. McCade." Both men turned at her approach, Silas with a look of surprise and something like admiration, Hargrove with barely concealed discomfort at being confronted by the subject of his criticism. "Mrs. Carrigan," Hargrove acknowledged stiffly, "this is a matter between McCade and myself. It seems to involve me quite directly," Willa countered, drawing herself up to her full height, which still left her looking up at both men. "My daughters, and I came to Mr. McCade's door in desperate circumstances, and he showed us Christian charity when my own blood relative would not. If the good people of the community find fault with such basic human decency, perhaps the problem lies with them, rather than with us." Hargrove's face darkened at her boldness. "A woman in your position should show more humility," he said, his tone suggesting he was conferring unwelcome advice rather than delivering an insult, especially when dependent on another's generosity. "Mrs. Carrigan and her daughters are not dependent," Silas interjected before Willa could respond. "They earn their keep and more, and they stay at my invitation for as long as they choose." The statement, delivered with quiet certainty, caused something to shift in Hargrove's expression, a reassessment, perhaps, of the situation he confronted. "I see," he said after a moment. "Well, that's your decision to make, McCade, but don't expect the community to embrace it, or them." He glanced at Willa with undisguised disapproval. "Town has standards to uphold. Town can keep its standards. And its opinions," Silas replied evenly. "I keep my own counsel." Hargrove nodded curtly, as if this response confirmed some private theory. "Just remember, McCade, reputations are easier lost than regained, and not just yours." With this parting shot, he turned and strode back to his horse, mounting with the fluid motion of a man long accustomed to the saddle. Willa and Silas stood side by side, watching as Hargrove rode away, his figure diminishing against the vast Wyoming sky. When he had disappeared over the rise that marked the property boundary, Silas turned to Willa with an unreadable expression. "You shouldn't have had to hear that," he said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "I've heard worse," Willa replied, aiming for lightness but achieving only a brittle approximation. "And at least Mr. Hargrove had the decency to say it to our faces rather than behind our backs like the good people of town." Silas studied her for a moment, noting perhaps the high color in her cheeks, the tension in her shoulders. "It doesn't matter what they think," he said finally. "Not to me. But it should," Willa insisted, the strain of the encounter catching up with her. "You have to live in this community, Silas. Long after we're gone, you'll have to deal with these people, trade with them, depend on them in hard times. Your standing matters." The use of his given name, the first time she had spoken it aloud, hung between them, significant as a declaration. Silas seemed to notice it too, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "You're planning to leave, then?" he asked, the question casual but his eyes intent on her face. Willa faltered, caught off guard by the directness of the query. I don't know, she admitted. We can't impose on your kindness forever. It's not imposition, Silas said quietly. Hasn't been for some time now. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words pressing between them like a physical presence. Finally, Silas gestured toward the house, where the twins' faces were visible at the kitchen window, watching with undisguised curiosity. We have an audience, he observed, his tone lightening slightly. Willa turned to see her daughters quickly duck out of sight, then reappear a moment later, unable to contain their interest. She couldn't help but smile despite the tension of the preceding conversation. They've never been skilled at subtlety, she acknowledged. Together they walked back to the house, maintaining a proper distance between them, but with a new awareness of each other that made even this small space feel charged with significance. The confrontation with Hargrove had forced into the open questions that had been simmering beneath the surface of their daily interactions, questions about the nature of their arrangement, its duration, its perception by others, and, most delicate of all, the evolving feelings that neither had been ready to name. In the kitchen, the twins greeted them with a barrage of questions about the visitor and his business, which Willa deflected with practiced maternal skill. Mr. Hargrove just needed to discuss some ranch matters with Mr. McCade, she explained, directing them back to the task of sorting the eggs they had collected. Nothing for you two to worry about. Silas watched this domestic scene with an expression Willa couldn't quite interpret, something between longing and uncertainty, as if he were viewing a painting he admired but didn't quite believe could be his. After a moment he cleared his throat. I should get back to the north pasture, he said. Fence won't mend itself. Willa nodded, understanding his need for solitude after the confrontation. Dinner will be ready at the usual time, she said, the ordinary words carrying a weight of reassurance that the rhythm of their shared life would continue despite Hargrove's intrusion. After Silas had gone, Willa busied herself with household tasks, her mind turning over the morning's events like a worry stone. Hargrove's disapproval, while unpleasant, was not unexpected. She had been naive to think their unconventional arrangement would escape community scrutiny or judgment. What troubled her more was the realization that she had begun to think of the McCade Ranch as home, of herself and her daughters as having a place here beyond the temporary shelter she had initially sought. It was a dangerous attachment to form. Silas had been generous, certainly, and there was a growing warmth between them that couldn't be denied. But he was a man still mourning his wife, still keeping her room as a shrine until Willa and the twins had needed it. Whatever fondness he felt for them might be genuine, but was complicated by grief and loneliness. To build hopes on such a foundation was to risk another collapse when her daughters could least afford it. Yet when she thought of leaving, of taking the twins and starting over yet again in some new place, a hollowness opened in her chest that felt perilously close to grief. It wasn't just the practical considerations, though those were significant. It was the thought of no longer seeing Silas each morning at the breakfast table, no longer watching as he patiently answered the twins' endless questions, no longer sharing those quiet moments on the porch at day's end when the barriers between them seemed to lower just slightly, allowing glimpses of their true selves to emerge. That evening, as Willa prepared dinner, a stew made with the first tender greens from the garden, she heard the twins in the yard, their voices raised in some game of their invention. Through the window she saw Silas return from his day's work, pausing to observe the children's play, with that same expression of wistful longing she had noticed earlier. As if sensing her gaze, he looked toward the house, meeting her eyes through the wee Tato. Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement perhaps of the complicated emotions stirred by Hargrove's visit, or a silent communication of shared purpose despite external disapproval. Later, after the twins were asleep, and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Willa found herself once again on the porch steps beside Silas, the evening ritual neither had articulated, but both had come to rely upon. The air was mild, fragrant with the scent of spring growth and distant rain. Hargrove won't be the last, Silas said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. Town has formed its opinion? Yes, Willa agreed softly. I expect that's true. Silas turned to look at her, his face partially shadowed in the gathering dusk. "Does it trouble you what they think?" Willa considered the question honestly. "For myself, no," she said after a moment. "I learned long ago that others' opinions matter far less than one's own conscience. But for the twins—" She hesitated. "Children need community, Silas. Friends, schooling, a place to belong without whispers following them." "They have that here," he said, his voice low but certain. "This is their place now, if they want it to be." The statement hung between them, weighted with implication. Willa's heart quickened, but she forced herself to respond cautiously. "That's generous of you," she said, "but we both know it's not so simple. Not with the town already talking. Not with men like Hargrove watching for any sign of impropriety." Silas was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, where stars were beginning to emerge against the deepening blue of the sky. "There's a solution," he said finally, his tone deliberate, as if he were feeling his way through unfamiliar territory. "A way to silence the talk and give the girls the community they need." Willa held her breath, understanding where his words were leading, but afraid to presume, to hope, for what she had not allowed herself to want. "We could marry," Silas continued, the words emerging with the careful precision of a man unaccustomed to emotional declarations. "Make official what's already true in practice, that you and the twins are part of this household, part of this—" He hesitated, searching for the right word. "This family." The proposal, for that was what it was, despite its practical framing, struck Willa with the force of a physical blow. She had not expected it, not so soon after Hargrove's visit, not delivered in this straightforward manner that somehow made it more profound than any romantic declaration could have been. "Silas," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "is that truly what you want? Or is it just a solution to the problem Hargrove represents?" He turned to face her fully then, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "It started as the latter," he admitted with characteristic honesty, "but the more I considered it, the more I realized it's what I've been wanting without knowing how to ask. You and the girls, you've brought life back to this place, Willa, back to me." The use of her given name, spoken with such quiet intensity, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. "And Eleanor?" she asked, unable to prevent herself from voicing the question that had hovered between them from the beginning. "Eleanor is gone," Silas said simply. "I'll always carry her with me, but she wouldn't want me to stop living because she did. She'd want this house to be a home again." Willa nodded, understanding the truth in his words. She had come to know Eleanor through the objects she had left behind, through Silas's stories, through the very structure of the house that had been built around her presence. And everything she had learned suggested a woman who would have wanted life to continue, joy to return, love to find new expression. "The twins adore you," she said softly, allowing herself to consider the possibility he was offering. "They've never had a proper father figure. James was absent even before he left for California." "And you?" Silas asked, his voice rough with emotion rarely displayed. "What do you want, Willa?" The question, so direct and yet so complex, deserved an equally honest answer. Willa took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I want a home for my daughters," she said. "Security, stability, and—" She hesitated, then continued with quiet determination. "And I want what I never thought to find again after James left. A partner, someone to share the burdens and joys with, someone to trust." She met his gaze steadily. "I've found that here with you." Silas reached for her hand then, his calloused fingers enveloping hers with surprising gentleness. It was the first deliberate touch they had shared, and it carried more meaning than any words could have conveyed. A promise, a connection, a beginning. "Then say yes," he said simply. Under the vast Wyoming sky, with the house that had become their home a solid presence behind them, Willa made her choice. "Yes," she whispered, the single syllable containing worlds of possibility. Silas lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with a reverence that brought unexpected tears to her eyes. It was not a passionate gesture, but one of profound respect and tenderness, the perfect expression of this man who spoke more clearly through actions than words. Tomorrow there would be practical matters to discuss. When and how to marry. What? To tell the twins how to face the inevitable community reaction. But for now, in this moment suspended between day and night, between past and future, they allowed themselves to simply be two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built something valuable from the broken pieces of their previous lives, who were choosing to move forward together despite the whispers that might follow. And in the shadows of the porch, with stars emerging like silent witnesses overhead, that choice felt not just right, but inevitable, as natural, as spring following winter, as necessary as breath. The wedding took place on the first Saturday in June, when the Wyoming landscape was at its most forgiving. Wildflowers dotting the prairie in splashes of yellow and purple, cottonwoods along the creek unfurled in pale green splendor, the sky an endless blue canopy overhead. It was a simple ceremony, held in the small white church at the edge of town, with only a handful of witnesses present. Willa had worried about finding a minister willing to perform the service, given the whispers that had followed them since Hargrove's visit to the ranch. But Reverend Thompson, a mild-mannered man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, had received them with unexpected warmth when they'd approached him 2 weeks earlier. "Marriage is a sacred institution," he had said, studying them thoughtfully across his cluttered desk, "but it's also a practical one, especially in these territories. A man needs a woman's touch to make a house a home, and children need a father's guidance." He had smiled then, his gaze moving between Silas and Willa, with quiet approval. The Lord works in mysterious ways, bringing people together when they need each other most. The Reverend's acceptance had been a balm to Willa's anxieties, though she knew not everyone in town shared his generous perspective. Martha Holloway had been pointedly cool when Willa visited the general store to purchase fabric for a new dress, and several women had stopped their conversation abruptly when she entered, resuming in whispers after she passed. "It doesn't matter," Silas had assured her that evening, when she recounted the experience with forced lightness. "What matters is that we know what we're doing is right." Now, standing beside him before the altar, Willa felt a sense of peace that transcended the community's judgment. She wore a dress of dove-grey cotton, simple but carefully made, with lace she had salvaged from one of Eleanor's old collars at the throat and wrists. The twins stood beside her in matching blue dresses, their wheat-colored hair neatly braided and tied with ribbons, their faces solemn with the importance of the occasion. The ceremony itself was brief, the traditional words spoken with quiet conviction. When Silas produced a ring, a band of silver worn smooth with age, Willa gasped softly in recognition. "It was my mother's," he explained in a low voice, meant only for her. "Eleanor kept it in her jewelry box for safekeeping." The gesture moved Willa deeply, this offering of family history, this tangible connection to the past that would now be part of their shared future. As Silas slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands steady and sure, she felt the weight of the moment, not just the public commitment they were making, but the private one that had been building between them over the months since her arrival. At his door. After the final blessing, as they turned to face the small gathering, Willa was surprised to see several faces she didn't recognize. Men who nodded respectfully to Silas, women who offered tentative smiles to her and the twins. Not the entire community by any means, but enough to suggest that not everyone shared Hargrove's disapproval or the Holloway's judgment. The reception was held at the ranch, where Willa had spent the previous days preparing the house for guests. The sitting room had been transformed with fresh curtains and polished furniture, vases of wildflowers brightening every surface. The kitchen table groaned under platters of food, fried chicken, potato salad, fresh bread, and a cake that Mrs. Thompson, the